So we were covering the questions regarding, well, just Krishna's whole explanation, right? His whole sort of almost shotgun explanation of the yoga ladder. I think it's Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. He says at the end of his commentary on the second chapter that it's really it's a real sutra scattershot sort of explanation of all of the different elements of the yoga ladder, right? And I don't know if any of you have tried to read the Vedanta Sutra or any sutra, but the sutra genre is known to be very hard to understand because it's so concise, it's so condensed. And the second chapter is very much like that, as per at least his analysis. There's a saying in Sanskrit that for the writers of sutras, they get more joy out of removing even a single syllable from their texts than they do from the birth of any of their children, because they enjoy so much making these texts very condensed. And therefore, in the genre of sutras, much more important actually than the sutra itself are the commentaries on it, because the sutras are so dense and hard to understand. Again, if you try and read the Vedanta Sutra, if you read Bhanu Maharaj's translation of the Vedanta Sutra, which I wouldn't particularly recommend, not because it's bad, but just because it is very dense, right? And it may be better to you know, finish all of the Bhakti-śāstrī courses all the way through before starting that one. But if you were to read it, you'll find the Sanskrit is like 3 words long, and then the English is like 5-6 sentences. It can often be like that because it's just so condensed. And then as you pull out the meaning, it gets very complex. So all that to say, the second chapter of Bhagavad-Gita is very much like that. As you can see, as you could tell when we're moving through, it's like we just barely got used to an idea and then we're getting introduced to a new one, right? It's this almost overwhelming series of like, now we have Sakama Karma Yoga, now we have Nishkama Karma Yoga, now we're talking about Jnana, now we're talking about Bhakti, what's Buddhi Yoga, you know, all of these things, right? And the rest of the Bhagavad-Gita is very much explaining the second chapter. So we were going through and we were discussing probably one of the more substantial sections of the second chapter, and that is the Nishkama Karma Yoga. And so we were discussing a very important point, and that's just why I've come back from this revision to this slide, especially in the next chapter. I really want you to be familiar and comfortable with the idea that when we use the words karma, and when we use the words jnana, and when we use all these words, we use them in a very concise, specific way, right? We're specifically referring to theological concepts. We're specifically referring to philosophical concepts. But that's not necessarily how language works, and that's not necessarily how it needs to work, right? So because of that, we'll find in the Bhagavad-Gita that Krishna will often use these words, but he'll use them much more loosely. So I want that to be clarified, because especially in the next chapter, we'll find that Srila Prabhupada, he translates the word karma as bhakti, right? And that'll cause a complete category error if we're still thinking rigidly. But we shouldn't, again, because that's not how language works. These categories, these strict terms that we develop later on, these are our developments to help us systematically understand and discuss the Bhagavad-Gita. That's not necessarily the strict and only way that these words can ever be used. These are more structures that have been developed in order to have a more structured understanding of the conceptions and understanding of the Bhagavad-Gita. Anyway, so we went on and we discussed, of course, a few points from each one of these texts. We connected the concepts, and we did all of these things. So I'm going to go back to text 45, and we'll just discuss the remainder of the texts before we move on to the last section of the second chapter, and then we will begin our study of the third chapter. How many people began reading the third chapter? Free Jai. The third chapter is very nice. It was my favorite chapter the first time I read Bhagavad-Gita. Let me just flip to 245. Okay, so then we discussed 245, and then let's go to 246. Yavan artha udapane sarvata sampluto dake tavan sarveshu vedeshu brahmanasya vijanataha. Maybe we can have Katyayani Mataji, you weren't here last week, were you?
Sorry, Prabhu, I was unable to attend last week.
No problem.
I heard the class. I followed the class.
No problems at all. I was just saying, so then you can speak because you were missing out last week on reading out.
Okay, Prabhu, thank you. Translation. All purposes served by a small well can at once be served by a great reservoir of water. Similarly, all the purposes of the Vedas can be served to one who knows the purpose behind them.
Thank you. So here, Krishna, right, now describing, and as I said, we can take these texts in many ways, but of course in this course, we take it primarily in Srila Prabhupada's ways. My main point of mentioning how the other acharyas will understand these words in differing ways, not contradictory ways, but in differing ways, was just to show that, was just so you don't get shocked if you ever hear somebody referring to these in different ways. There's good ways to, and there's strong ways, as we've already established, to justify all of Prabhupada's readings, and Prabhupada's readings can be found in all of the previous commentaries. But I was just saying, just so you could see that there's some diversity in the text of Prabhupada, he's very much pulling out the nectar, right? So, Srila Prabhupada, this section, it's referring to devotional service, right? And so here we find, again, this concept of the yoga ladder, but we find it in a slightly different way. Because here, what do we find, right? All of the great reservoir of water, it can serve the functions of so many different wells. This is how our acharyas have understood it. And I think I said last week, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, what did he say? He said that at least in traditional India, you would go to a different well for a different thing, right? You wouldn't drink from the same well that you would wash your pots in, right? You wouldn't drink in, you wouldn't bathe in the same well that you would drink in, right? All of these things would have different uses, right? So, however, in the great river, in the great body of water, people will do all of these things, right? They'll wash their laundry, they'll bathe, etc., etc. And bhakti has this relationship to all of the other steps on the yoga ladder as well. It not only is higher than all of them, but it also includes all of them, right? It is not only greater, but it also includes all of them as well. And therefore, by the performance of bhakti, one need not perform all the others. And this is the really essential point here. Sometimes when we're discussing the bhakti yoga and the yoga ladder, devotees will think, okay, well, where am I? And I'll climb up it, right? Where am I? And I'll find my spot and climb up it. But the fact of the matter is, at least for the overwhelming majority of us, right? We are already at that top level, right? Because by practicing bhakti yoga, you're already in that great grand reservoir of water, right? You are already there. And so the tiny wells don't really have much point to you. Why would you leave the great body of water in order to drink from these small other wells? So bhakti very much is fulfilling the purposes of all of them. And I'm hoping once we finish the 18th chapter, right at the end, we'll have a few lessons sort of recapping the whole Bhagavad-Gita. And I'm going to go through that a whole lot because it makes a whole lot more sense when you know all of the texts and you can connect them all and see how they all get fulfilled in bhakti. So this point is being made. And this is why at times our acharyas can do things which seem somewhat confronting or somewhat confusing, right? Because we're so much used to this idea that the karma kandya, ethics, religion, all of these things, they dictate some things, they dictate the baseline, and then we add bhakti on top of them. But actually bhakti in of itself is independent and supreme. His Holiness Bhakti Vikas Maharaj gave a very wonderful seminar on this. You can watch it, it's like 8 hours long, like 8 sections long. And he just talking about this theme, right? And at the end, he said, oh, well, I've had to rush through my notes. There's a lot of content. And the whole idea is bhakti is independent to all other processes and actually independent to anything else. And it is also supreme. It is independent in the sense, not only that you don't need to do any of the others in order to practice it, but also that bhakti only spreads by bhakti's own will, right? We need the association of the Vaishnavas to receive bhakti. And the Vaishnavas, they are the tool of Bhakti Devi herself, right? So in this way, bhakti is independent. Not by our desire can we practice Krishna consciousness. And it is supreme in that it is not a permutation of the material energy, as we were discussing in 245, right? It's not a transformation of material energy. It is internal spiritual energy manifesting in this world. And it is also supreme because it is at that height of the yoga ladder. And of course, it includes everything as well. And therefore, we find Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, especially, he would do so many things and he would be criticized, right? He would be there in a car, right? He would be driven around in a car. Ooh, all of the karma kandis, they were all very scandalized by this. How can a sannyasi be driven around in a car, right? How can he do that? This is sense gratification, right? That's what they would say like that, right? Oh, he's wearing a watch. That would be a really popular one. They would say, how can he call himself renounced and wear a watch, right? They would say all of these things. But why was he riding around in a car, right? He was riding around in a car in order to preach Krishna consciousness, right? Why was he wearing a watch? In order to facilitate the same purpose. And because, again, he is bathing in that great reservoir of water, then what are other concerns, right? Even sannyas itself, right? Sannyas was not practiced in our line for a long while, right? And so people said, oh, it's these specific rules, but what did Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur do? Well, he just introduced it, right? He introduced it, not too concerned about the specifics, because he's trying to come to the essence of the grand reservoir of water, that essence, to love Krishna, to practice bhakti. So we're very much an essence-seeking movement, right? And this is, of course, not something that is unique. This is not something that we've just sort of decided to introduce to be pragmatic. It's right here in the Bhagavad-Gītā. It's right here. All of the purposes of all the other things can be achieved when one is practicing Krishna consciousness. And because of that, one need not be concerned with the other processes. So there's that point. Now we'll quickly go through the remaining texts so that we can get up to this Sthita Pragya. So then we hear karmanyeva dhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karma phala heturbhur ma te sangostva karmani. Maybe then let us have Rani Mataji. Would you like to read out the English?
Hare Krishna. You have a right to perform your prescribed duty, but you are not entitled to the fruits of action. Never consider yourself the cause of the results of your activities, and never be attached to not doing your duty. So
at this point, thank you very much, Mataji. At this point, we are almost definitely discussing Nishkama Karma Yoga. Even Srila Prabhupada is discussing in terms of Nishkama Karma Yoga in the purport. Because why? Because what is it saying? Adhikaraste, right? Your adhikar. This word adhikar, what does it mean? It means right. It also means qualification, right? We have a Kanishta adhikari, we have a Madhyama adhikari, and we have an Uttama adhikari, right? There's all these different levels, right? I remember once when I was with Nrsimha Kavachu Prabhu, I told him, I said, oh, Prabhu, Kanishta adhikaris like me. I said that, and then Prabhu, he looked at me and he said, oh, wow, so qualified, you're a Kanishta adhikari. But anyways, so adhikar, right? It means qualification, right? It means you're right. And so therefore, now we know, because this is not the absolute consideration. Now this is the relative consideration, right? Now we're speaking, Krishna is speaking relative to Arjuna's qualifications, right? He's saying, okay, now, but for your adhikar, this is what I'm giving. And of course, the prescription for his adhikar, we'll pick this up as a theme throughout at least these first 6 chapters, is that Krishna very much thinks the healthiest and most appropriate thing that Arjuna can do is niskama karma yoga in terms of the pastime. Obviously, Arjuna won't be satisfied with that because he is still ultimately a devotee, and we'll discuss that further in the 3rd chapter. So, in this sense, we are hearing now that he is saying, so I've described all of these things, but what do I think for you? I think that you should perform your prescribed duty, right? You should perform your dharma, you should perform it, but you should not feel entitled to the fruits of your action. Just so everyone's clear, fruits of the action just means the results, right? All the benefits you can get, all of the goods and all of the bads, right? Okay. Never consider yourself the cause of the results of the activities and never be attached to not doing your duty, right? So never be attached to either thing, right? Don't feel in your detachment, right, that you become attached to your detachment, right? Krishna's making this point. Don't be, oh, I'm so beyond this, and then you get attached to the idea that this work is below me, right? Because then you will act as Arjuna does inappropriately, and you will abandon the work altogether. We will discuss this furthermore, but we'll find that the equiposed soul, right, the soul that is properly situated, is not attached to attraction, nor is he attached to disgust, right? Both are forms of attachment. Just one is attachment going towards something, and the other is attachment going away from something. I once heard one brahmachari, he was telling me, I can't remember which temple, it was one temple in India, Gauriya Vaishnava temple. I think it was even an ISKCON temple. And he was saying, he asks all of the upcoming brahmacharis, are you revolted by the idea of family life? And if any of them say yes, he said, then you can't be a brahmachari for this point, right? It shouldn't be based on your revulsion, because that is not a proper way to situate it. Because then you're just situating you're situating yourself on what you dislike and not what you like. And therefore you are more connected to that which you dislike than you are connected to that which you like. Okay, yogastha kuru karmani sangam tyaktva dhananjaya siddhya siddhyo samo bhutva samatvam yoga uchyate. Maybe then we can have Varun Prabhu. Would you like to read text 48? Maybe gone AWOL. Maybe we'll have Tarun Prabhu. Would you like to read text 48?
Yes, Prabhu. Perform your duty equipoised, O Arjuna, abandoning all attachment to success or failure. Such equanimity is called yoga.
Jai. So, again, we'll just keep moving on forward just to know that I think we can sort of read between we can get the flow. We can get the flow of these texts now, okay? We get the idea of what Krishna is establishing here. So then, now we have, and we also know that Nishkama Karma Yoga is being discussed here, because again, Prabhupada, what is he talking about? He's not talking about bhakti, he's not talking about Krishna consciousness. In one sense he is, but in the final section of the purport, what does he say? He is participating in the Varnashram Dharma institution, right? So we know now Nishkama Karma Yoga is being discussed because now we're hearing about Varnashram. As we know, Varnashram just means that the religious system, right? Following the 4 Varnas, following the 4 ashrams, doing your right duty, doing the right thing, right? Okay, so that's how we can see Prabhupada, he's also indicating there is this transition. Then let's go to text 49. Durena hyavaram karma buddhi yoga dhananjaya buddha sharanam anvicha kripana falla hetavaha. And then maybe let's have somebody's sending a message. Okay. Jaswant Prabhu, would you like to read out the English?
Yes, Prabhu. O Dhananjaya, keep all abominable activities far distant by devotional service, and in that consciousness surrender unto the Lord. Those who want to enjoy the fruits of their work are miseries.
Jai. So, This word, those who want to enjoy their fruits of their work are misers, right? So this word miser is a very nice one to have in the Sanskrit, because it parallels the Brahmana, right? We have the Brahmana and we have the Kripana. We have both of them, right? So the Brahmana, he is very good, right? He is very competent in not being a miser, because he is not trying to enjoy the fruits of his work. But the Kripana, he is very much working hard, get all these fruits of my labor and enjoy all of them. And why are they misers, we might say? Also, it's very ironic, because Dhananjaya, what does Dhananjaya mean? Who can tell me in the word for word? What does Dhananjaya mean?
Conqueror of wealth?
Conqueror of wealth, exactly. So is a conqueror of wealth a miser, right? Krishna, he's saying, oh, Dhananjaya, conqueror of wealth, you're so wealthy, you shouldn't be like these misers, right? Who are trying to enjoy the fruits of their work. Why are they misers, right? They're misers because they're actually getting they're not using appropriately their funds, their resources. They do not know how to utilize the riches that they have, right? They use them inappropriately, and therefore they're considered misers, right? A person who uses wealth well is frugal, not a miser, right? But a person who inappropriately does not use their wealth correctly, that is a miser.
Prabhu, I have a question. Can I
Yes,
just
for
ask?
sure. Yeah.
In this purport, they say Buddhi Yoga means transcendental loving service to the Lord. Is that the same as Bhakti Yoga then?
Yes. So, Mataji, just because I know you joined recently, we discussed this maybe 2 classes ago. It can be taken different ways, but Prabhupada takes it as Bhakti Yoga, and it's a vague term, okay? So the term sometimes can mean Nishkama Karma Yoga, and sometimes it can mean Bhakti Yoga, right? It's unclear, because Krishna, his descriptions can almost apply to both. So some of our acharyas will read it as Nishkama Karma Yoga, other ones will read it as Bhakti Yoga. In one sense, it can refer to either of them. But in general, Prabhupada, wherever he can read Bhakti, he does read Bhakti. So yes. So the way Prabhupada's using it, it means Bhakti, but it can be confusing, because sometimes people use it to refer to Nishkama Karma Yoga.
Okay.
Does that clear it up?
Yeah.
It's very confusing stuff. Don't worry.
Yeah.
I'm confused too. So, okay. So yes, so he's making this point. Now, I won't say the Sanskrit just so we can power ahead. Varun Prabhu, hope if your mic's working, would you like to read out text 50?
A man engaged in devotional service rids himself of both good and bad reactions, even in this life. Therefore, strive for yoga, which is the art of all work.
Jayy, right? So here we find again this back and forth, right? The texts aren't necessarily clear in either way, and so the acharyas will take their differing readings. But very much again, devotional service is, I think, a very natural reading of this. Why? Because it rids them both of good and bad actions. Of course, Nishkama Karma Yoga also does so, right? Because you're transcending all the fruits of your work. But bhakti is very much activity, which is destroying both the good and the bad, right? Sometimes I get asked on fasting, on days where we have some sort of fast, right? And I get people who ask me, so what benefit do I get from this fast? And actually, the standard response is you'll get no benefit with that mindset, right? Because you're doing it for some good works, right? If you're doing it for some good fruits of your actions, well, the benefits you get from fasting today are birth, old age, disease, and death. That's the fruits you can get from fasting today if you're doing it for good karma, right? We fast for devotion, right? Because in devotion, there is neither good karma nor is there bad karma, right? Again, Traigunya Vishaya Veda, Nistraigunya, right? It is transcending the 3 modes, right? And therefore, if it's the 3 modes, they have good or bad, they have dualities. But the transcendental mode is above all of them, and it is fully just bhakti, fully just love. Now, the next text, maybe Divyansh Prabhu, would you like to read out text 51?
Yes, Prabhu. Is my mic okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. By thus engaging in devotional service to the Lord, great sages or devotees free themselves from the result of work in the material world. In this way, they become free from the cycle of birth and death and attain the state beyond all miseries by going back to Godhead. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Jai, Jai, very nice. Thank you. So we'll just go on, but nectar purport. Please read near in time. Parampadam is a very central theme also when you read the Rig Veda. Text 52 then. Yada te moha kalilam buddhir vyati tarishyati tadagantasi nirvedam shrotavasyya shrutasya cha. Maybe Srinivas Prabhu. I asked Katyayani Mataji. So let's have Srinivas Prabhu. Would you like to read out the English?
Thank you, Prabhuji. When your intelligence has passed out of this dense forest of delusion, you shall become indifferent to all that has been heard and all that is to be heard. Hare Krishna.
Jai. Thank you. So here we go. Again, some people will say, why are you reading the yoga ladder into this text, right? Somebody might say, where is it saying the yoga ladder, right? And of course, it'll become more explicit later on that there very much is a yoga ladder in there. But they might say, right? And this is Arjuna's confusion, actually, which will situate us in the 3rd chapter when we get there. People will say, like, when you see Vivekananda, right? How does he explain everything, right? There is karma yoga, there is raja yoga, there is bhakti yoga, there is jnana yoga, and you can all do, each one is its own separate process, and each one will get you all the way there, right? This is how he explains it. Or should I say this is how he misexplains it. And this is sort of his proposition. But this is not the structure that the Bhagavad-Gita has, because Krishna, he is not saying that all of these are equal. If we don't have a yoga ladder, Krishna is contradicting himself throughout. Because what was he saying before? Fight, O Arjuna, and attain all of these benefits, right? From doing your duty, from doing the right thing. But now what is he saying, right? He's talking about this dense forest of delusion. And what will he say in the next text, right? He'll say that when your mind is no longer disturbed by the flowery language of the Vedas. So what is this dense forest of delusion, right? Well, delusion is what has disturbed the mind. And what has disturbed the mind? It is the flowery language of the Vedas, right? So we see here that Krishna clearly, he's building up some hierarchy, right? He's clearly building up a ladder. Because at one point, he's saying, oh, you should do this. And at the next point, he's saying these are sources of delusion. These are sources of bewilderment. So like this, we find the yoga ladder is very deeply and dearly reflected in the Bhagavad-Gita. Now, there's one final point I want to make here, and then we will begin the conclusion of the 2nd chapter, the Sthita Pragya. In many ways, actually, these texts are the conclusion of the 2nd chapter. When the 3rd chapter begins, Arjuna's just asking about these texts, right? He's talking about, oh, you're talking about Buddhi yoga, you're talking about karma yoga, you're talking about jnana yoga. I'm so confused, right? That's going to be Arjuna's question that begins the 3rd chapter. So to conclude this, we find a very interesting point. And that is, again, the central idea that karma kanda, all of these things, at one point when one is practicing Krishna consciousness, these things are secondary. There is no need for any of these other things, right? There is no need for all of these other systems. His Holiness Bhakti Vikas Maharaj, he gives the example, right? Because we'll have all of these rules and all of these systems, but they're not there. They're not, how do I put it? They're not necessary, right? They're not necessary for the process, and therefore they're not there in Krishna consciousness as Srila Prabhupada has given us, right? How simple Srila Prabhupada has given ekadashi, right? Just don't have grains, right? If you read in all of the different shastras and all, you don't eat it all on ekadashi. On the day before ekadashi, you should only have one small meal. On the day after, you should only have one small meal. People say, oh, nirjala ekadashi, nirjala ekadashi. If you follow the strict shastras, every ekadashi is a nirjala ekadashi. But Srila Prabhupada, he did not establish this. Srila Prabhupada, of course, I'm not discouraging you if you want to do nirjala ekadashi, but I also am discouraging you if you do nirjala ekadashi and it prevents you from focusing on your rounds, distributing books, speaking about Krishna, hearing about Krishna. If you're there hearing the Bhagavatam class and all you hear when all of the words come out of the speaker's mouth is all you hear is paneer sabji, roti, and rice, right? Then maybe, maybe better not to do nirjala ekadashi, right? Because it's only there for a certain purpose. So Srila Prabhupada, he has given a very simple process. And so this is the pastime from His Holiness Bhakti-Vignaraj Maharaj. When Maharaj, he got his second initiation in Vrindavan. No swimming on Ekadashi. Yes, I wish. In Vrindavan, he received second initiation from Srila Prabhupada. And when he went to Srila Prabhupada, he had read in one book, all the complex ways that you can chant Gayatri mantra, right? This how to calculate the specific minute that one should sit down, right? 3 times a day, exactly how many degrees in the sky. I can't remember the exact details, but he found some. And so he went to Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada, he spoke the Gayatri, not just all the Gayatris, all the Diksha mantras, Gopal Gayatri, Guru Gayatri. Often when people hear second initiation, they think, the one that begins Om Bhur Bhuvasvan. I don't want to initiate everyone here, so I won't finish it. But people think of this, but actually there's a whole bunch of mantras. There's not just one Gayatri mantra. Gayatri is a type of mantra, and there's many Gayatri mantras that one receives it. Anyway, so Srila Prabhupada, he told all of them. And then he said, you should recite these 3 times a day, sunrise, midday, and sunset. Yeah, like that, right? And so he said like that. And Bhakti-Vignaraj Maharaj, he said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. And then he started saying, and I should do it at this time. And he started giving all of these details. He was trying to impress Prabhupada. And Prabhupada just looked at him confused. And he just said, no. Just at Mangalarti, at this time, at this time, at this time. He said like that. He said simply like that again. And Bhakti-Vignaraj Maharaj, he said again, he said all of the details. And Prabhupada just looked at him confused. And he said, don't overcomplicate all of that, right? So this is the point, right? All of these things are secondary, right? And in fact, what will happen? They will cause a dense forest of delusion, right? There'll be so much confusion, right? So much difficulty. People will be debating left, right, and center. Should we do this? Should we do that, right? I still remember once I was listening to some devotees discuss, and there's actually a, sorry for the crude example, but in some shastras, it describes the correct direction to face while urinating, right? And so they were talking about, as devotees, we need to make sure people have this information, right? But again, it'll all be bewilderment, because then people will think that we come to Krishna consciousness in order to understand, how to go to the bathroom properly, which is not the point of Krishna consciousness, and it'll become a point of bewilderment, right? Because then they'll have spent all this effort implementing all of these stringent rules, and where will there be time to remember Krishna, which is the whole point of Krishna consciousness. So on that note, I think we will conclude that section, and we will begin to discuss the Sthita Pragya, everyone's favorite. So again, as I said, this concludes, this section will now be our conclusion of the second chapter, and then we'll be able to shoot through speedily through all the other chapters. Again, I hope you can see how the Bhagavad-Gita in its second chapter, it introduces all the main concepts, which is why it's not just because it's so many shlokas long that we take so long to get through it, but because we're actually getting introduced to everything that we're going to be discussing further on, right? And now that we're starting to complete the chapter, I hope we can all see that that is true. Before I move along, are there any specific questions? Okay, then let's keep on going. So what happens is then Arjuna, he says, we get Arjuna uvacha sthitta pragyasya ka bhasha samadhi stasya keshava sthittadhi kim prabhasheta kim masita vrajeta kim. Maybe we can have Nandan Prabhu, would you like to read out the English?
Yes, Prabhu. What verse was that?
Text 54.
Yeah. Arjuna said, "O Krishna, what are the symptoms of one whose consciousness is thus merged in transcendence? How does he speak and what is his language? How does he sit and how does he walk?"
Jai, thank you. So everyone always has a question when they first read the section. They think Arjuna's asked all these nice questions and Krishna never answers them. He starts talking about senses and boats and all this sort of stuff. He's never talking about walking and sitting. What's going on here? We will discuss that, because these things, they actually mean something much deeper, right? They mean something much deeper than just, does he walk quickly or does he walk slowly? How many kilometers an hour is his gait, so to speak, right? This is not what Arjuna is asking, right? But the first time, I think everyone sort of expects that, right? Everyone sort of expects, does he walk happily or does he walk sadly, right? Does he walks with a smile on his face? That's sort of what people expect to hear. But that's not what we will get. We will get something much, much deeper, and we'll get the purport of Arjuna's question. Because Arjuna's question, and I've also written up here, you can see this is how Krishna answers all of them. Arjuna's questions, we can say maybe, they are all referring to how can I then recognize these individuals, right? These people, you've described all of these different high things, right? How can I recognize them? How can I recognize a person on such a platform, right? What are their symptoms? Which is a very important question for us to have, right? Because in spiritual life, all of spiritual life can be summarized in one thing. It's not chanting, right? It's not doing puja, right? It's not studying shastra. Please don't drop out of Bhakti-śāstrī after me saying that, but it's not doing any of those things, right? Spiritual life is summarized in the association of the devotees. This is what spiritual life is. And it is association, especially with advanced devotees, right? People will hear sadhu sangha and they think, oh, well, if I play cricket with them, then that counts, right? And maybe it does, right? Maybe a tiny bit, but that's not what we mean by sadhu sangha. Sadhu sangha means finding people who we can hear Krishna Katha from, and if they are on the same level as us, speak Krishna Katha too. Or if they're on a higher level, if they ask us to speak Krishna Katha too, right? It's those people who we can find Krishna Katha among, right? Who we can associate in service. This is sadhu sangha. And we should be longing for any sadhu sangha. All sadhu sangha is good, right? But we should be longing for sadhu sangha of the really advanced devotees, right? Those, or at the very least, those devotees who are more advanced than us. Which is why I often say it's very fortunate to be an absolute beginner in Krishna consciousness like me, because I don't have to worry about making that deliberation, right? Everyone practically is more advanced than me, so it's very easy. But as you go along deeper and deeper, these questions become more and more relevant, more and more pertinent. So he's asking these questions, and what are these questions? Ka bhasha. Of course, it literally means what is his language, right? But this is sort of meaning, I realize now that I've mixed around them. Question 2 should be, how does he speak? And question 1 should be, what is his language? But what it means by what is his language, or what are the general symptoms, right? What is his general way of expressing himself, right? So that is there. Then we have, how does he speak? How does he sit? And how does he walk? As we get to each one, we'll find out what they actually mean. But in general, it means, how does he respond to the world? How does he not interact with the world? And how does he interact with the world, right? And then we'll find Krishna's answers make a whole lot more sense. Now, what we've seen here also is something very nice, because we're seeing the birth of the structure of the Bhagavad-Gītā. I initially had all of the questions put here, but it messed up the formatting too much. So last second, just earlier today, I deleted all of the verses, all of the text, and I just have this list up here. It still has the effect. As you can see, all of these texts are texts where Arjuna asks a question. The Bhagavad-Gītā is driven by Arjuna asking questions. Arjuna's questions give structure to the Gita, and they also drive forward its content, right? So as we can see here, it is not that Arjuna asks questions here or there. It's throughout the Gita. He will be asking questions. And we will find, especially when we get up, I'm very excited to get up to the 3rd chapter now. When we start the 3rd chapter, these questions are sometimes very challenging. They're very direct. Arjuna, he is opening up his heart, and he is establishing his doubts, not disrespectfully, not rudely, but very directly, right? He is not ashamed of the fact that he doubts, because he knows that doubt is doubting is like tilling the fields so that the seeds of faith can be planted. Okay, so we find here, now we are beginning really that process of the Bhagavad-Gītā. The Bhagavad-Gītā itself is a questioning text. It is a question. It is a text that is a back and forth of doubt and faith and questions and answers. And in this sense now, I always say now we have begun the Bhagavad-Gītā, and in another way now we have begun the Bhagavad-Gītā, right? Okay. So let us now hear the responses. So first, what do we hear? Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Prajahati Yada Kaman Sarvan Partha Manogatan Atman Yevatmana Tushtaha Sthitta Pragyastadochyate. Maybe we could have Mrunal Mataji. Would you like to read out the English?
Hare Krishna. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, O Partha, when a man gives up all varieties of desire for sense gratification, which arise from mental concoction, and when his mind, thus purified, finds satisfaction in the self alone, then he is said to be in pure transcendental consciousness. Hare Krishna.
Jai, 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 Jai. So here we find, again, we find the word the sthitta pragya, right? This is the concept we want to get towards. This is the focal theme, right? He who is situated in wisdom, he who is situated in understanding. And we are hearing now the general symptoms, right? So the whole thing, in a sense, is elaborating on this. What are the specific symptoms now that we've heard the general symptoms? Now, this glorification of this whole passage, this whole section, can apply to personalists. It can also apply to impersonalists, right? It can apply to either category of individual. However, we'll find that Srila Prabhupada says, and very, very correctly, as always, that, and as I say, it's not even that we can say Prabhupada's opinion. When I say there's different ways of reading it, the Prabhupada's opinion is one among many. I would say Prabhupada's opinion is in one sense the best, because anyone who has a different reading, ultimately they agree that the ultimate reading is the reading Prabhupada is bringing forth. And anyone who doesn't agree with that is, in my humble opinion, is not properly reading the text, right? So yeah, but Prabhupada, when he says Bhagavad-Gītā as it is, we will bring our assumptions of what as it is means. And in our mind, we think as it is means the most literal reading. But what Prabhupada means is as it is means interpreted in light of the text, right? We let the text speak for itself and then we make it clear, right? We draw out the ultimate purpose of every single text, not a secondary purpose, right? Which is, in my opinion, again, and I'm sure you'd all agree, a much more useful as it is, right? A much more useful sense of that concept. So it can apply to personalists or impersonalists, but as we read on, we'll see that the personalist most fully embodies this, and that the personalist most fully can execute these qualities for many, many reasons. Okay, now let's go to text 55. Dukeshvanu dignamanaha sukeshu vigataspriha vitaraga bhaya krodha sthittadhir munnir uchyate. Maybe Mrugank Prabhu, would you like to read out the English?
For sure. One who is not disturbed in mind, even amidst the threefold miseries, or elated when there is happiness, and who is free from attachment, fear, and anger, is called a sage of steady mind.
Jai, Jai, Jai. So now we find the answer to the question, how does he speak? Because what is meant by how does he speak, right? It means how are his intelligence and words affected by another's affection, anger, indifference, right? How does he respond? These are the three general categories, right, that agitate people's minds, right? Affection, right, can agitate our mind. Anger can agitate our mind, and indifference can agitate our mind, right? These are the three different categories. So Arjuna is saying, how does he respond, right? When somebody says nice things to him, how does he respond? When something says bad things to him, how does he respond? And when somebody doesn't care about him, right? How does he respond, right? And we find all of these things, right? In conditioned souls who are not fully in control of their mind, we can experience all of them, right? I'm sure we all have some sort of experiences. I know whenever somebody says something nice, right, nice to me, you know, I want to be all humble. Oh, Prabhu, you know, oh, Mataji, oh, Prabhu, you know, I'm just a fallen servant. But inside, there's a part of my voice that says, well, thank you for noticing. You are correct. You are clearly very intelligent for saying this nice thing about me, right? So we can see here that I'm definitely not a sthita pragya, right? And with a negative thing, whenever people say, I still remember once I was having this discussion. I was having a discussion with somebody, and they were very much disagreeing with me. And at the end, they got really angry at me. And he said, you know what I think? I think you are such a moron, and you are lying through your teeth. I do not think any human being could actually be as stupid as you are unless they are lying through their teeth. That's what he was telling to me. I remember, like, he was fully, and I was trying, and on the outside, I was like, okay, I was saying, you know, thank you, you know, for informing me of my position, you know, thank you for reminding me, all of this sort of stuff, right? All of this, but inside I was like, oh, how dare you, when I see him the next time, I'm gonna tell him what's what, right? So again, right, this is how we respond. And indifference is the worst one, right? We're doing something and we're thinking, wow, you know, how it's almost worse than the anger, right? We're doing something and we want people to notice, right? Notice me, notice what I'm doing, right? Notice my greatness. This is what it all boils down to. It's people not acknowledging, or people are acknowledging my greatness. And this is the agitated mind. What are the three things? So the three things are affection, anger, and indifference. Those are the three things. And those three things, how do they respond, right? How does this person respond? So 56 and 57, they are discussing these. Now, 56 brings up a concept that I very much think is important, which is mental speculation. Because how often do we hear, oh, that is mental speculation, Prabhu, right? We hear this often. That's mental speculation, right? And I find sometimes devotees inappropriately apply this, and I think very unhealthily inappropriately apply this, almost in a cultish manner, and that is not what we want, right? Mental speculation is bad, and Srila Prabhupada, he has given the wonderful description, right, of mental speculation. The word muni means one who can agitate his mind in various ways for mental speculation without coming to a factual conclusion. It is said that every muni has a different angle of vision, and unless a muni differs from other munis, he cannot be called a muni in the strict sense of the term, right? So this mental speculation is, I'm having an opinion for opinion's sake. I want to have an opinion different to everyone else. I want to come up with all of these different ideas. Yes, this is condemned, right? This is not appropriate, right? And this is not good. This is practically what academia is. I still remember I was talking to one of my professors. He was saying the best way to start up an academic career is you need to be published, right? They say publish or perish. If your work is not published in academic journals, your career will perish. And actually, in today's job market, your career is going to perish either way in academia. but definitely the principle is publish or perish, right? But he was saying the best way to get published is you just find some discussion that people are having, read a few of the articles that are being had, and then come up with a brand new opinion. Try to find a way you can disagree with everyone, and then you can get it published, right? But this is not necessarily the healthiest way to continue the discourse of knowledge, right? It's disagreement for disagreement's sake, right? And so this could be an example of the Muni mindset, right? Another aspect of the Muni mindset is also just speculating, just the general principle, right? This is a symptom, right? Disagreeing for disagreement's sake is a symptom. But the general principle is that they just kind of enjoy just thinking new ideas for new ideas' sake, right? Another example I remember, some of the brahmacharis were telling me, one individual was once giving Bhagavatam class. And in it, they were saying, Krishna appeared to me wearing jeans. And so I've realized, this is in the Bhagavatam class on the Vyasa. Krishna appeared to me in my dream wearing jeans. So there's actually a planet in the spiritual world where Krishna is wearing jeans. And the brahmacharis actually, they told me they got up and left. They thought, like, we can't facilitate this, you know? This would be an example of like the Muni mindset, right? Like, why? What is the point of all of that, right? And so it's this speculation, right? But that is sometimes, I think, this concept of mental speculation is inappropriately applied. And sometimes people want to put down devotees for thinking, for wrestling with questions, right? Not just wrestling with questions, but trying to see, maybe we've misunderstood this. Maybe Prabhupada wasn't saying what we've always thought he was saying. Maybe, or maybe something less controversial, or just they're trying to wrestle. Prabhupada says two things here. How do we understand it? And people will say, mental speculation. Or people will have a legitimate idea and they'll try to wrestle with it in terms of Shastra, and they'll say, look, I don't know for certain, but it seems to me that it's this, this, and this, for this and this and this reason. This is not mental speculation, this is thinking, right? And thinking is not something we should condemn as devotees, because when we do condemn thinking, then we are acting in a cultish manner, and Krishna consciousness is not cultish, right? And it should not be cultish. Thinking is good, right? Thinking is great. What does Krishna say? Okay, Hare Krishna, Alex. What is said about the Bhagavad-Gita at the end? He who studies this text, he worships me with his intelligence, right? He who studies with this text, he who wrestles with this text, he who thinks about this text, he has performed worship, not mental speculation, right? So I don't want people to misread this. And I also want people to know this, because often you'll run into it, right? You're trying to think about the philosophy and somebody say, mental speculation. No. Respectfully, decline such a condemnation, right? Because you should always feel that it is healthy to think. And why? Again, at the end of the Bhagavad-Gita, it is said, Krishna doesn't say, but Krishna does say, yeah. Whoever studies this text, he is worshipping me with his mind. And we find also, we find also that the whole point of the Bhagavad-Gita is, what is it? Is wrestling with ideas. Let's think out loud, right? Let's process these ideas. So again, mental speculation, bad. Thinking is very good. How can we tell what is the criteria of what is good thinking? This is a very, very famous line. I'm sure we've all heard it before, from the second shloka of the Srimad Bhagavatam. It's just one section of that shloka. The highest truth is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all, right? This is how we can distinguish, right? What is just pointless mental speculation? Why? Why is something that is not following this mental speculation? Because it's just being done for no one's welfare. It's done for your fun, right? But when we're thinking, when we're trying to think productively, when we're trying to think importantly, right? When we're trying to think in all of these ways, in any way which is thinking, which is trying to think about Krishna, right? This is for the welfare of all, right? Thoughts about Krishna are very elevating for everyone, right? So this is a general criteria, that I think, for what is thinking and what is mental speculation, right? All sorts of things people will speculate. And again, mental speculation is pointless, right? Because you're just wasting your time. It's not like you're actually thinking anything useful. It's not like you're actually thinking anything to try to understand how Krishna consciousness applies to the world, or, its understanding, right? You're just saying, well, what if this and what if that, right? That's all the big what ifs, but sometimes they are important, right? So again, I can't give an exact process for determining the two, right? But I do want to say that there is a distinguishing point between the two. Thinking is so very important, because if we don't think, we can't engage our mind in the worship of Krishna, and we also just become brainwashed automatons, which is not what Krishna wants, right? Krishna dances, right? And dancing is a spontaneous thing. It doesn't come from how do you put it? Dance is spontaneous. It is not something rigid, right? It is not a rigid thing, which is once it's fully pre-programmed, it's not truly dancing anymore, right? A dance in its fullness is a spontaneous expression. And so we want individuality, we want personalities, and to crush down thinking, that is very, very much crushing down personalities. Okay, we'll keep on going. Then the next text, and then maybe after the next text, we will have our 5-minute break, because the next text is just continuing this thought. Maybe, who have I not asked? Vignaraj Prabhu, would you like to read out the English of text 57?
57?
Yeah.
In the material world, one is unaffected by whatever good or evil he may obtain, neither praising it nor despising it, is firmly fixed in perfect knowledge.
Jayy. So here we find again that principle, right? Neither praising it, neither loving it, but not hating it either, right? One should neither praise it nor despise it. Again, what happens when you despise it, right? You're just thinking about it all the time. You're just attached to it in the opposite direction, right? You're attached to the fact that you move away from it, right? Praising it is being attached that you move towards it. In either ways, you're still connecting it to yourself. This is another, not to bash Mayavadis again, but it is our ISKCON's official sport, right? And this is the fault with their philosophy, right? Because impersonal liberation is that I am moving away from this world in all respects, but you've defined yourself in your aversion to this world, right? You've defined yourself in your rejection of this world and not in your acceptance of the spiritual world, right? You've defined yourself in your rejection of material life and not in your acceptance of spiritual life. So again, we find this is the fault, right? It's like often we'll see in Australia, right? You'll have a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and then they break up and they're all upset, right? And it's like the person that keep on complaining about their ex-girlfriend or their ex-boyfriend or something. I don't know if any of us have seen this in some people we may know, right? And they always complain about them, right? And they're always saying, oh, you know, this and this, or they're always thinking about them. They can't, quote unquote, get over them, right? It's a similar idea. They're constantly meditating upon them. Practically, they're as involved with them as they were when they were positively involved, right? They're still constantly meditating on this dynamic that they had, right? So in that sense, we can find this, right? Hatred is just as much attachment as desire. Just two sides of the same material world coin. So on that note, let's go for our 5-minute break, and then we will come back and continue discussing and maybe have an activity or two. Okay, so I'll see you all, what's the time now? Yeah, I'll see you all at 7 past. Definitely, yes. No, I understand your skepticism, but I actually realized we're not that far behind schedule. It's because I modified a few of the brackets. That's why I panicked over how behind schedule we are. But we're only like 1 or 2 sessions, which is fine because I did that anyways. So we will definitely, the skepticism hopefully will clear your doubt and create some faith by the end of this.
It's a good pace, Prabhu. It's good pace. Don't run.
No.
I know Nandan Prabhu is very eager to complete this course, but
he'll base it off pratyaksha jayy. Okay, so we were discussing here just a few, just another point I quickly wanted to make with text 56. Just to back up again, right? My reading of Muni, right? It doesn't say, because Prabhupada says that the Muni is bad, but he doesn't say that the Sthitadhir Muni is bad, right? Because what does the shlok say, right? Sthitadhir Munir Uchyate, right? So it is not that thinking is bad, right? Because it's being glorified. It's just thinking in a way that is not beneficial. Thinking in a way that is literally thinking for thinking's sake. It's just another form of sense gratification, right? But thinking pragmatically, thinking for the good, right? Thinking for benefit, thinking for the good of one's faith, one's understanding, thinking for the good of others, right? Thinking of ways to understand Krishna consciousness, thinking, can I understand Krishna consciousness? Like all of these things are good forms of thinking, right? Because we have this Sthita Dhir Muni, right? And this here is reflecting in the text that again, I do want to stress that point. Another thing, we find the 3 prongs of material suffering, or rather the 3 prongs that really agitate one, right? Raga, Bhaya, Krodha, right? I gave the 3 before, the 3 things which trigger people, and these are other things, right? Raga, Bhaya, Krodha, and they all relate to each other. Actually, ultimately, they all come from Raga. They all come from attachment, right? because these are the things which ultimately agitate the mind. Again, let us not forget that this section is describing, how does he respond to the world, right? And so raga is attachment. You're attached to something. When something you're attached to is going away, being taken away, being threatened, you might not get it. What happens? Fear, right? You're afraid I might lose it. And fun fact, everything that you're attached to in the material world eventually does go away and disappear. And what happens when it does eventually be taken away from you? Then krodha comes, anger, right? We can see this most strongly with little children, right? With little children, they want some candy or something, and they'll get really anxious if it gets removed. And if it does get removed, they get angry and they start crying and flailing around. And the fun thing is that society today is 99% also big children who do much the same thing, but with maybe things more sophisticated than candy. So what is Krishna saying here? He's saying that the Sthitadhir Muni, he is not agitated by those things at all. Yes. So then now let us go on to text 58. And 58 now is beginning the question of how does he sit, right? How does he sit? Which is meaning, how does he not engage his senses? He is existing in this world, right? How does he sit? How does he sit in the senses, right? How is he situated, staying still, right? How does he exist in the world without having his senses taken away into the world, right? And therefore, when we get to walking, it's going to be, well, then how does he engage his senses when he does engage his senses in the world? So sitting is not moving in the world, passively existing in the world. How does he do that? And then walking is how does he actively exist in the world, right? I'm sure we can see how those concepts relate. It's not just that we've randomly pulled out other meanings, right? They're the deeper esoteric meanings of this. So then text 58, in order to fulfill both my desire and Nandan Prabhu's, we'll just read the English for the remainder of these, except for the next text. So then text 58, maybe Rohan Prabhu, would you like to read out the English?
Sure. 258?
Yeah.
One who is able to withdraw his senses from sense objects, as a tortoise draws its limbs within the shell, is firmly fixed in perfect consciousness.
Jayy, nectar. So here we find, right? Here we find a very, very nice metaphor, right? Of this is how he sits, right? He's withdrawing his senses. He's pulling them in, and he doesn't have them agitated by anything else, right? But we will find, right, the question can be said, well, two questions can be said. One question can be said, and this is a question that Krishna will often clarify in this section, is it will say, well, you know, when you're asleep, right, you've sort of retracted your senses, and right? Or you can also ask the question, how can one actually retract their senses? How can one actually disengage them, right? And this is the focal theme of this section. It'll talk about the sense control. And that's why I said earlier that Prabhupada, in his reading of applying all of this to bhakti, all of this to the personalist, he is cent% on the money, because only the personalist can truly and fully do this meaningfully, right? So we will say, how can a person do this? This is very hard. How can one withdraw from their senses? This is a story I very much like. And it's a story of an adulterous woman, right? In Vedic times, right? So we know today an adulterous woman is maybe not the biggest scandal, unfortunately, but in Vedic times, you know, scandalous indeed, right? And so in order to meet her, I forgot the word, but in order to meet her, the person she's committing adultery with, right? She would escape in the middle of the night, right? So that nobody would see, because if the scandal broke out, it would be very scandalous, right? And so she would run in the middle of the night in the darkness, right? And she would run and run and run. Paramour, that's the word I was looking for, right? And she would run. And so she would run through the forest as well, just for extra security. And so one day she was running, and there was an impersonalist yogi, right? And he was sitting down and he was meditating, and, you know, he realized he was Brahman and all of that fun, right? And he was doing all that, breathing in and out. Srila Bhakti-siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Prabhupada, he will say the yogic process of blowing your nose 3 times, because we know they'll do like this before they start their meditation. So he'll anyways, it's just Bhakti-siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada roasting people. So he would say that, right? And so he was there meditating, very equiposed. And this woman, she was so much, she was running and she bumped into him and knocked him over. And instantly he broke out of his meditation. And she kept running and went all the way back. And the next morning, right, because she was returning back home, she could have an excuse. So she was walking during the daylight, but she still didn't want it to be known by everyone, right? So she went and she was walking along and she was still in the forest in order to keep some secrecy, right? And walking in the forest, she saw that yogi again. And she went and she did, dandavats, right? Panchanga dandavats, right? And she paid her pranams and she said, oh, great personality, right? Please accept my humble obeisances. And he recognized her because, even though it was dark at night, when somebody bumps into you, you get a rough glimpse of them, right? And he said, what are you doing? Is this some sort of joke, right? Is this some sort of joke that you're paying respect to me after bumping into me and totally ruining my meditation last night? And she said, what did I do? I'm sorry, I don't remember doing anything. You must be thinking of someone else. And he keeps on speaking. And of course, just because he's an impersonalist doesn't mean he doesn't have the benefits of Jnana Yoga. So he has some good understanding of people, right? And he understands that she's telling the truth. And he realizes, right? He realizes something. In her attachment, right? In her attachment for this, for her paramour, right? She was so single-minded and focused that even bumping into me, it could not break her meditation, right? Even if her meditation was not on something very good at all, it could not be broken at all. She didn't even realize she bumped into me and she just kept on going. But here I am, right? And my meditation was completely disturbed and disrupted by what? Just somebody bumping into me. She is running through a forest and all she can think of is the object of her meditation, right? And here I am, some master yogi, and just one slight thing completely agitates and disturbs me focusing on my object of my meditation. And we'll find that, and then he thinks, well, if only I would have such an intense emotional attachment, obviously not to a paramour, but to the Supreme Personality, right? If I could engage myself as a person, right, in my love of this, if I could engage in the Supreme Personality as a person, as the object of my meditation, then I will have true stability in my meditation, right? And this, I find Prabhupada, he very much takes this message and applies it in his reading of this section, as I think we should all, right? Because all of these things, while technically applying to impersonalists, definitely apply to personalists. And therefore, what happens is we have the next text, such a famous text, one of the best texts, one of my favorite texts, I should say, rather. Another one of my favorites. Let's have Vidhi Mataji, would you like to recite the Sanskrit? And then, yeah.
Sanskrit will be tough, Prabhu. I'll give it a go.
No problem. It's the standard meter. It's the da 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 da.
Visaya vinivartante niraharasya dahinaha rasa parjam raso payasya param drishtava nirvartate.
Jai. Now this, yes?
Sorry, no.
Oh, I thought somebody said something. Jai. So this is Nectar, and then maybe for the English, who have I not asked? Have I asked Srimati today?
Hare Krishna, I can go, yeah.
Okay.
Though the embodied soul may be restricted from sense enjoyment, the taste for sense objects remains. But ceasing such engagements by experiencing a higher taste, he is fixed in consciousness.
Jai. Nectar. Now this text is very, very deep. We can talk about it. We could do a whole Bhakti-śāstrī course just on this text, okay? So we won't comment again on all of it. But this is a very, very essential text. And I want to focus in on a few specific points in particular. And the specific thing is obviously oriented around that final that final line, param drishtva nivartate, right? Once he has tasted something higher, he will not go back to the lower taste, right? This is the essence, actually, of Krishna consciousness. This is the principle I just explained, right? Because people, they will do so many things to restrict their senses, but once they've got something higher, they won't even need to try, right? And the purport, obviously, for this text, please, mandatory reading, all of you, even if you don't regularly do the readings, please read the purport. It's a nectar purport. All the purports are nectar, but this one in particular, right? So this point here is very essential to our understanding of Krishna consciousness, and also essential to our understanding of Bhakti Yoga, and also essential to our understanding of how we should be practicing, realizing, and understanding Krishna consciousness. So, firstly, param drishtva nivartate, right? Here we find the conceptions of those who say, understand the self, meditate on the Atman. Remember I said, what is Samadhi? Samadhi is focusing on two things. Who can tell me? Samadhi is an understanding of which two things? Who can remember? I'm not going to say it. You'll have to end up guessing. Who can tell me? What are the two things you have to understand in Samadhi? Samadhi is oriented in two directions. What are they?
Prabhu, knowledge of the self.
Yes.
And oriented towards the Lord.
Yes. So knowledge of the self and knowledge of the Lord, right? Oriented towards, yeah, completely. That is Samadhi. Yes, as Nandan Prabhu said, knowledge of self and Lord. This is Samadhi. And here, Krishna, he is making it explicit. It is not enough just to meditate on the self and understand the mind and understand the soul. One must param drishtva nivartate, right? One must go to param, something which is beyond. One must experience that, right? So this is one thing that's central. Samadhi is defined by this as well. But another thing, and I think really here we're coming to the heart of it, Krishna consciousness is experiential, right? Shraddha is experiential. Often we will say Shastra is the highest pramana. But Shastra is the highest pramana in one sense, but experience is an even higher pramana when that experience flows from Shastra, when that experience flows from Bhakti, right? Bhakti-siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he writes this wonderful essay called Thakur Bhakti Vinod. And I won't get into it now. I will get into it later with Guru Tattva. It's an amazing essay. And in that, he makes an interesting point. He says, what else is Shastra but the words of the sadhu conveying that param drishtva that they have experienced, right? What else is Shastra but that experience of transcendence recorded? We find Jiva Goswami makes a similar point in Tattva Sandarbha. He justifies the authority of the Bhagavatam through Shastric reasoning, but also in the fact that Vyasadeva entered into deep meditation on the Lord in order to produce it, right? Krishna consciousness has an experiential dimension. And that experiential dimension is the heart of it. This is where Krishna, he is appealing to. He is saying, what will happen? You will transcend all of these things. You will understand all of these things, right? The soul may be restricted from sense enjoyment, but the sense remains, right? But these things, they cease. You are fixed in the higher consciousness when you have an experience, right? Not when you've read all the books, right? But when you have experienced that higher taste, right? Param drishtva nivartate, right? When one has experienced the beauty of Krishna, when one has experienced the joys of devotional service, not fully. I'm not saying when one has cried tears of ecstasy the moment they see a photo of Krishna, right? Don't get me wrong, that's definitely something we should aspire towards. But just when one has those experiential moments, then one truly becomes situated in Krishna consciousness. Again, that's not sentimentalism, because there also is a philosophy, right? But faith is something much deeper than logical reasoning. Faith is something much deeper, right? Than something you can argue your way into, which is why sometimes I'm not so much a fan, right? People will say, in order for preaching, let us read all of these philosophical arguments this philosopher has come up with and that philosopher has come up with. But I'm not particularly convinced that's the best. Of course, some arguments are good, right? In order to get rid of people's hesitancy. But the heart of preaching is sharing the joy of Krishna consciousness, right? This is the heart of it, right? Because that is the heart of creating faith. And this is the heart of experiencing faith. There's sometimes an analogy that's used. There's an example that's used. One can read in the newspaper, right, that tomorrow there will be rain. But when one squeezes the newspaper, water does not come out. One needs experience tomorrow to see the rain, right? Does that make sense? So we can read in Shastra, and it's true, right? And of course, Shastra is much more reliable than weather forecasts, but we know that it's true, right? But until we experience it, we have not experienced the rain, right? We must experience that reality. Param drishtva nivartate. And that's why we say, right, perform devotional service. Your study of Shastra is not complete until you've gone out and applied it, right? Until you've gone out and experienced it. And this is our epistemology, right? And we find this. That's why we'll find Jiva Goswami, he even says, and I'm focusing on this point because I think it's an important point. Jiva Goswami, he speaks about a category. This is coming to Nandan Prabhu's question. It's up there. I have a few of my favorite questions that's been asked. And so far, Nandan Prabhu, he's up there with this one question, which is how can we tell, why do the acharyas have all of these explanations, all of these extra details, right, in their commentaries, right? This is a very deep question. And the more and more we ponder it, the deeper and deeper we'll go into our understanding and realization of Krishna consciousness and its philosophy. And Jiva Goswami, he makes a point that there's something called Shastra Yukti, right? When one is experiencing the pastimes of Krishna, when one is experiencing bhakti, then one can comment on it, on Shastra, because they are experiencing the reality that Shastras are pointing towards, right? When we find that there are descriptions of the moon, and okay, look, maybe you believe in the moon landing, maybe you don't. But for the sake of argument, let's say the moon landing happened, right? Okay, you can say, and let's take a fully scientific understanding of the moon, right? We're not going to talk about it as a heavenly planet. Let's just say it's just a rock in the sky, just in order to make this analogy make sense, right? We might have many descriptions, right, in books, but when Neil Armstrong or whoever goes on there and he experiences it and he comes back, right, he's more than valid to give extra explanation, to detail it, right, because he has that experience. Or maybe a less controversial example, one can write about Paris all that they want, right? But when one actually goes to Paris, right, then they can comment on the travel guide, right? The travel guide, it might be written by somebody who went to Paris, but when somebody is in Paris, they can comment further on the travel guide, and it is their right to do so because they're experiencing it. This is Shastra Yukti, and that's how we can find our acharyas make all sorts of details. And it's not just in Bhagavad-Gita, and it's not just the Goswamis, Bhakti-Vinod Thakur. Maybe this is a very Rasic example, but do we know that one line where Srimati Radharani's name is mentioned in Bhagavatam? The gopis, they're there when Krishna, he disappears, and they see the footprints, and they recognize from the footprints which gopi Krishna has gone away with. And they realize, oh, this is Srimati Radharani, right? But they don't say her name directly because Srimati Radharani's name is never directly said in Bhagavatam. Say Radhanam, right? This is the gopi who worships Krishna the best, right? There is no description of who says this, but Bhakti-Vinod Thakur, because of Shastra Yukti, because he is experiencing that reality, right? What does he say? He says that this verse was spoken by Chandravali, right? Srimati Radharani's main competitor, right? Here we find in the pastime a full acceptance of Srimati Radharani's supremacy as the greatest devotee, right? And so he finds that. And that doesn't flow from textual study because textual study is on the lower rungs. Textual study is valid, but it is on the lower rungs, the higher levels of knowledge and understanding. And in fact, the highest level is experiential. It's param drishtva nivartate. It is experiencing those devotional realities. And so we find this. And therefore, we also find a call, right, for faith, right? So often, I dislike this in ISKCON. There is a culture of demanding faith sometimes. I'm not saying this is a criticism of ISKCON. I'm saying this is a criticism of the approach that some devotees might have, right? You must believe in this person. You must believe in that person, right? You must hold this person as your guru. You must hold this person as an authority. But this is not how Krishna is explaining it. And this is not how spiritual life works. His Holiness Gaur Govinda Maharaj says, you can legislate respect, but you cannot legislate belief. You can legislate respect, but you cannot legislate faith, right? You can tell somebody, if you're an ISKCON, you have to respect everyone in the ISKCON guru list, right? You can say that you have to respect all the sannyasis, right? You have to respect all the senior devotees, but you cannot tell anyone that you must have faith in them, because faith comes naturally from the heart, right? We cannot force it. It is something which flows naturally. And where does it flow from? It flows from param drishtva nivartate, right? It flows from us having this experience, from us experiencing something higher, from us experiencing something true, from us experiencing something which organically and naturally produces faith. Can we get upset about somebody saying something disrespectful, maybe about a sannyasi? Yes. Can we get upset if a person humbly and simply has not yet developed faith? No, we can't. Right? And how is that faith developed? Yes, it is developed by situating yourself in the philosophy, of course, right? We don't want sentimentalism. We want to hear those words of those people who experienced param, 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 the highest of the highest of the highest. We want to hear those words and have them guide us so that we can experience that, right? But then we must also experience it. So I've spoken a lot on this text, but I think it is a very important text to understand. So we're going to have an activity now. This activity will maybe be a little less quote unquote productive than the other ones, but it's one that I did in my Bhakti-śāstrī and I enjoyed it a lot. I really, really relished it. It's in a sense an icebreaker one, but I'm going to split you all into smaller groups maybe for 5 minutes. And if we can all share at least maybe one time where either we've seen somebody else experience something higher, or even better, if we've experienced to some degree. I'm not saying, oh, that one time I realized my form in the spiritual world and I fell down in ecstatic moods and I was shaking on the ground. Nothing like that. Just a point in our life where we've experienced a higher taste in Krishna consciousness. It could be something as simple as I realized I enjoyed kirtan more than I enjoyed, I don't know, going to parties or whatever. That was a boring example, but you know what I mean, something like that. It can be something as simple as that, because I don't think that is so simple. I think that is a very profound and deep experience, even if maybe we don't recognize it. So if we can all just share that in the groups with each other. 5 minutes, I'll give you 5 minutes. It will be 5 minutes just because it's not like, I doubt we'll run out of time, right? Okay, and how many people are there today? 16 people. 4 groups of 4, how does that sound? Okay.
How did we ever अपना taste experience get Krishna consciousness में?
Okay, I'm going to open all the rooms, and then so just to make it clear, so we're sharing a time where we have experienced in any way this higher taste, right? Not necessarily we're saying I'm relishing the higher taste always, I'm a pure devotee. Just one time when we realized that, well, actually Krishna consciousness is a higher taste than what I'm tasting before, right? So you don't need to feel like you're violating some principles of arrogance or anything, right? Just sometime when you've experienced that. Okay. So I'm going to open all the rooms and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. We'll meet again at 11:39. Okay, so please enjoy the rooms. I'll pause the recording. Okay. So I hope some of us at least enjoyed that. I remember really enjoying that activity when I did in my Bhakti-śāstrī. So that's why I thought it's a nice icebreaker as well. I hope that we all become like we all really come to appreciate each other's association by the end of the course. And I think those activities are really fun. So even though I said it's not quote unquote productive, I think it's probably the most productive, right? Because we're learning how to, we're not learning, we are relating to the other devotees where we're appreciating each other. So that's the most productive thing. I'd much rather somebody learns none of the shlokas and learns to love the Vaishnavas. But I would also rather you do both. So don't take that too far. Okay, so we'll keep on going. So with the next few texts, we'll just go pretty rapidly through them. Because again, when you read the purports, they're pretty self-explanatory, actually. None of them are too out there, right? And they're all applying concepts we've already really discussed, which is that central concept that the senses are tamed by loving Krishna, right? So we're just going to read through them really. Is somebody unmuted? No. We're just going to read through them quickly. And then at the end, we'll just resolve that central theme. Again, when you read in your own time, even the purports, they're just great. Like, they're very practical. There's all these pastimes and everything, which I'd love to get into, but yeah. It's a shame it's only 2 years and not 20 years. That's all. That's all I'm saying. Okay. So now we get to text 60. Yattato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramattini haranti prasabham manaha. Okay. Would maybe Bhumi-gita Mataji, would you like to read out the English?
Sure, Prabhu. The senses are so strong and impetuous, O Arjuna, that they forcibly carry away the mind even of a man of discrimination who is endeavoring to control them.
So this text is nice because we find in it, this is leading up to the first mention of bhakti directly in the Bhagavad-Gita. We find hints towards it, texts which are probably referring to it. But in the next text, which this one very much leads into, and I'll explain how, we find the first mention of bhakti in the word matparaha, in relationship with me. Now we find Bhakti Devi is pouring forth, right? So how is this text related to that one? Purna Chandra Goswami, he says text 60 is explaining the sadhana and text 61 is describing the siddha, right? So often we will find these descriptions there at times describing different aspects. It's not describing one sthita pragya. Even though I say the sthita pragya, it's actually referring to different people at different times. It's referring to different stages. And therefore, if it's referring to different stages, it must be meaning different people, right? So we find that in text 60, we find what? The senses are so strong and impetuous, O Arjuna, that they forcibly carry away the mind, even of a man of discrimination who is endeavoring to control them, right? So this is the process. He is endeavoring to control them. However, then 661, one who restrains his senses, keeping them under full control and fixes his consciousness upon me is known as a man of steady intelligence, right? So 60 is the struggle and 61 is the perfection. And in that perfection, what do we find? Now that we found this perfection, mat paraha, right? In relationship to me. This is the height of yoga. This is bhakti itself, right? So here we find it coming forth. Okay, and now I'm going to skip the next two slides and come back to them. I want to discuss quickly, because now we have the famous series. Screenshot this, write this down, memorize it. This may or may not be in your closed book exam, okay? So this is actually, look, I'm going to tell you it will be. I think everyone should memorize these. Like, this will be in your closed book exam, okay? Please memorize this. I'll send a screenshot of this into the group chat, into the WhatsApp group. Okay, here we find the stages to fall down, right? In one sense, I think they're pretty self-explanatory as well, right? Because you contemplate this, your sense objects. We can think of an example, right? You contemplate the sense objects. Let's say you see a bar of chocolate, right? Then you get attached to it because you're like, I do like chocolate, right? There's your attachment, right? And then you develop lust. You're like, ooh, and I both like chocolate and I really much want chocolate, right? Then you don't get chocolate, right? Because you're on a diet or something, right? And then you get angry, right? And then as that anger begins to, that anger then results in clouding the mind, right? And when the mind is clouded, then you stop being able to actually properly use the facilities. And then, you get bewilderment memory. You've lost your whole, and once that's gone, you've just lost your whole ability to interact with the world, and then you fall down, right? Or bloop. I don't know how many, it's not so much used, I find, in modern day hip ISKCON, but back when my mother joined, like that was the lingo. Blooping just means leaving Krishna consciousness. It comes from a pastime with Brahmananda Prabhu. He said it to Prabhupada. He said they drop back into the ocean of Maya And then he said, oh, they bloop, because that's the sound of a pebble dropping into the water. So when they drop back into the ocean of Maya, they blooped. Anyways, that's a bit of it's a bit of a Niskan lingo. I don't know how many people use it today, but I haven't heard it so much, at least in Sydney. Yeah, okay. So I think this is all pretty straightforward. You can choose to memorize the Sanskrit or the English. You'll get 4 marks either way. But if you memorize the Sanskrit, it just sounds cool, you know, like that's all. And it's nice to associate with the Sanskrit. Prabhupada has given us the word for a reason, so we can go deep into the Sanskrit. Okay. Then what do we find? Okay. Then what do we find? But a person free from all attachment and aversion and able to control his senses through regulative principles of freedom can obtain the complete mercy of the Lord, right? So here we find a very interesting point, because these are the regulative principles of what? The regulative principles of?
Freedom.
Freedom, right? Regulation isn't freedom, right? How can regulation be freedom? What's going on here, right? Of course, this is not contradictory. Often we think, I remember I was talking to one of the brahmacharis, and he told me, I think this example to me establishes fully all of this. He said when he first joined the ashram, for the first few years, he really actually disliked it. Not disliked the Krishna consciousness and all, but he disliked a lot of the restrictions, apparently, the regulative principles of the brahmachari ashram, right? He said there's some days he woke up and he wished, oh, wow, I could just watch a documentary today, right? Not that I want to break the regular principles. I just want to do, you know, I just wake up today, I just want to eat rasgullas, right? I don't want to eat, you know, whatever is the standard thing that we're all eating in the ashram, right? This is what he woke up every morning. He's thinking, oh, you know, all the time I'm being regulated like this, and he didn't enjoy it. And he said, actually, after quite a few years being in the ashram, it took him a while for it to shift. But at one point, he realized that now, when he gets up in the morning, he does what he wants to do, not what his mind tells him he wants to do, right? Now, when he gets up in the morning, he can say, no, I don't want to watch a documentary because I actually don't. I'm not a slave to the pushes of my mind, right? Now, when I get up and anything I do because I want to do it, not because my mind has randomly thrown out this idea that, hey, don't you want this today? Don't you want that today, right? So what I realized before is that I am freer than I've ever been not having a TV than I ever was with one. And to me, I think that very much embodies how regulative principles are regulative principles of freedom, right? It is self-discipline in order to allow one to actually truly control the mind, to be disciplined that one does what one wants and not what the mind recommends constantly, right? I can do what my mind tells me to if I want to do what my mind tells me to. And that is true freedom. And that is how the regulative principles allow us to break this pattern. Because all the time, when I think of something, I do it, right? I just do it blindly. I don't think, do I really want to do it? And if I try and resist it, it's hard, right? That's what the regulative principles do. They build the freedom in order to resist the constant pushings of the mind, right? And people might say, oh, well, that's still control. But we all know that the mind's pushings aren't positive. They might say, what's wrong with following the pushings of the mind? And I would say, ask me the night before an exam when I haven't studied because I did everything else instead, even though I knew I should have studied weeks in the building up to it, right? And that's where we'll find the pushings of the mind aren't all necessarily positive. Vignaraj, I'll come to your question at the end, just so that we will finish today. Okay, one other point that I want to bring up is, what does it say at the end? Prasadam adhigacchati, right? Because, as I said earlier, at text 64, we are now passing into how does he walk, right? This is talking about how he moves, how he walks, right? And how does he walk, right? He obtains prasadam, the complete mercy of the Lord, right? Why? Because everything he does, you cannot avoid having the senses engage with the world, right? But through this process, everything you receive is prasadam. This is why Srila Prabhupada, he would give apples and fruit and sweets sometimes to devotees visiting him that weren't offered on the altar. They weren't offered on the altar. Why? Because Srila Prabhupada, he has connected everything to Krishna. Already it is offered by the fact that Srila Prabhupada has used it, right? The point of offering at the altar isn't that we perform a ritual and we clap a few times and ring a bell, right? That isn't what makes it prasadam. What makes it prasadam is that we do all of those things and we've then engaged it in service of Krishna. Srila Prabhupada, every breath he takes is engaged in service to Krishna. And therefore, when he gives an apple, that is prasadam. It doesn't need to be offered on the altar, right? Everything that flows from the pure devotee is prasadam. And therefore, prasadam adhigacchati. Everything that comes in and goes out is prasad. We cannot avoid engaging with the world, right? We cannot avoid it. We have to do it. What happens with the devotee is that all of the things which are coming in with the senses, they do not agitate him. He does not become materially involved with them. Instead, he becomes spiritually involved with them. He transforms everything that he receives becomes prasadam, and everything that proceeds from him becomes prasadam. And then text 65, for one thus satisfied in Krishna consciousness, the threefold miseries of material existence exist no longer. In such satisfied consciousness, one's intelligence is soon well established. One who is not connected with the Supreme can neither have transcendental intelligence nor a steady mind, without which there's no possibility of peace. How can there be any happiness without peace, right? So now, again, all of this is pretty straightforward, right? This is now Krishna, he's made his point, right? And now he's really pulling it out, right? As a boat on the water is swept away by a strong wind, even one of the roaming senses on which the mind focuses can carry away a man's intelligence. I love this, right? And of course, by man, we mean man or woman, right? Women are not exempt to the conditioning of material life. What I love about this is it says even one of the roaming senses. Well, I can tell you one thing, I don't have one roaming sense. I have many roaming senses. So if only one can do it, then what to speak of all of the senses that are roaming around, right? Completely thrown off. Therefore, O mighty armed, one whose senses are restrained from their objects is certainly of steady intelligence. What is night for all beings is the time of awakening for the self-controlled, and the time of awakening for all beings is night for the introspective sage. Now this text, this is in one sense one of the more concluding ones. What does this mean, right? It can be a bit confusing. What are you talking about? In one sense, it's literal, right? I don't know anyone besides the devotees who gets up at 4 a.m., right? I guess my Muslim friends do to pray, but then they sleep afterwards, right? So they get up, they pray, and then they sleep afterwards. But I mean, to be fair, so do most devotees. I did that this morning. But ideally, right, the devotees are waking up, but it's not necessarily meaning that, right? That is maybe a surface read. What it's saying is that what is night and day, it is where the senses are absorbed in. The materialist, what is day for them, where they put the light of their senses is in the world all around them, right? But the transcendentalist, he disengages the light of his senses from that and engages it on the self and on the Supreme Lord, right? Which the materialist is totally blind to, right? Therefore, where they shine the light, where the light is shining, that is day, and where it is not shining, that is night, right? So where the materialist is shining their attention to, the spiritualist is ignoring, and therefore it is night to him. And where the spiritualist is engaged in, the materialist is fully ignoring, and therefore what is day to that spiritualist is night to that materialist. Does that make sense? Please tell me if that's confusing, because it's a bit metaphorical, but in context, you can see how that's Krishna, he's giving analogies and metaphors to help explain this. And then we come up. A person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is ever being filled but is always still, can alone achieve peace, and not the man who strives to satisfy such desires. And again, this is the point that I was making before. How can we stop the senses? They all flow in, right? But for the devotee, they do not disturb, right? They just go in simply like the ocean is not disturbed by all of the rivers, right? All of these rivers are flowing into the ocean, but we don't see that the ocean's water level rises or falls because of it. Rises and falls because of humanity's abuse of nature, but that's a separate thing, right? So we find here, right, that that same principle, right? We cannot avoid the senses going in and out. So let us transform how we deal with them, right? We can say that the impersonalist, if we take this text as referring to the impersonalist, right, then they are walking, right? But I would say the devotee runs, right? Because the devotee does all of this, but on such a more intense platform. And then we hear a person who has given up all desires for sense gratification, who is free from desires, who has given up all sense of proprietorship and is devoid of false ego. He alone can attain real peace, right? And again, what does it mean to give up all desires for sense gratification? It means to embrace all desires for Krishna's service and the service of others. That is what it means, right? And then we conclude chapter 2 at 12 o'clock exactly. We concluded at text 72. That is the way of the spiritual and godly life, after attaining which a man is not bewildered. If one is thus situated, even at the hour of death, one can enter into the kingdom of God. Okay, so here we find what is translated as the kingdom of God? Brahma Nirvana. Nirvana, the Buddhist word. What's that doing here, right? We will talk a little bit in the later chapters, not chapter 3, but in the later chapters, we'll talk a little bit later about how Nirvana very much can be defined as the kingdom of heaven, even as the spiritual world, even in terms of Bhagavad-Gītā, not just in terms of our philosophy. Okay, so there, pranasyati, what is that in reference to? Which text is pranasyati in reference to? Okay, so on that point, we've concluded the second chapter. I was going to make some points. I was going to make some points here, but I'll make them next week regarding the Sthitta Pragya, because they do lead into the third chapter. It's not just because I wanted to finish chapter 2 today. They work as well to introduce the third chapter. And here we find a very nice conclusion. What did we just end up discussing? What was the second chapter? And then maybe, because it was Nandan Prabhu's stringent desire, we can have Nandan Prabhu read out this purport.
Prabhu, I can't see it on my screen.
Oh, is my screen sharing gone silly again? Okay, 1 second. Let me try again. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah,
I can't see it. Maybe
we can see it.
Okay, then we will have, who have I not asked? Rani Mataji, have I asked you today?
You have, but I'm happy
to. Okay, anyways, Rani Mataji, you can go.
Thanks, Rudy. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura has summarized this second chapter of the Bhagavad-Gita as being the contents for the whole text. In the Bhagavad-Gita, the subject matters are Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. In the second chapter, Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga have been clearly discussed, and a glimpse of Bhakti Yoga has also been given as the contents for the complete text.
Jai. Okay, and I'm sure, I hope now over the past few weeks after our study, we can see, we can think exactly how all of this has been laid out, right, in the summary. Okay, with that, I will go to questions. As always, you're free to leave. So Vignaraj Prabhu had a question, and did somebody else have a question? Or was it just Vignaraj Prabhu? Okay, what does it mean that he does what he wants, but not what his mind wants? He wants to do what his soul wants. Yeah, exactly, right? So, or rather, he does what his intelligence determines as the most appropriate thing, right? So we can make a distinction between intelligence and mind. The mind is the thing which is producing all these ideas and likes and dislikes. And intelligence is the means by which we actually interpret all of that data. For the average person, the mind is ruling the intelligence, right? The mind just says something and the intelligence says, okay, yes, I will do that. But once one has conquered these, the intelligence is in control of the mind, because the intelligence can interpret all the thoughts and ideas that appear in the mind and make that discrimination, that vivek, right? That determination. Is this the right thought? Is this the right thing to do? Is this thought something that is beneficial? So he wants to do what his soul wants, yes, but in his case, but somebody could also do this and maybe not engage the soul, but it's rather the conquering of the intelligence over the mind, right? And then when one aligns the wants of the soul over the intelligence, then one has that sort of causal line, right? Because the mind is just throwing ideas out. Right now, it's that the intelligence does what the mind wants, because the intelligence is that active principle. You know, when you're thinking, there's almost that passive principle of thoughts coming into your head. And then there's that active principle of like trying to discern and figure things out and process through all of them. That active principle is the intelligence, and that passive principle is the mind. So for the average person, the active principle just does whatever the mind throws out, right? I want to eat popcorn, I'm going to go eat popcorn, right? The mind puts out popcorn, you say, okay, yes, now I'm going to figure out how to do it. Whereas the other way around is that the mind puts that out and the intelligence determines, do I want that? And in his case, his intelligence is trying to determine what is most pleasing to the soul, which wants joy, which wants beauty, right? Which one is most pleasing? And therefore, in his case, yes, it is ultimately what the soul wants. Does that clarify it?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, that does clarify it. Thank you.
Jai. Okay, Vidhi Mataji.
Prabhu, I just want to take you back to text 47. I'm going to use a very mundane example. So the text says that Krishna is saying that you have the right to perform your prescribed duties, but you are not entitled to the fruits of the action. I'll take a very, very mundane example. We live in this material world, right? So we work, we need to bring food to the table, we need a roof over our heads, right? So we go into our jobs with full dedication, with full sincerity, we slog our asses out. Does this mean that I stop expecting that I don't get a salary, or I get a very nominal salary, I don't get any bonus, I don't get any increment? I'm doing my duty, but how can I not expect something in return for that? It's a very, very base level example, but then every work that we do in this world, there's a give and take involved over it, right? Because we do it because there's an end, it's an end, it's a means to an end, right? How do we get that mentality that we just do it without any expectation?
So that's very, very nice question. Thank you, because it touches on a lot, right? And it really, I think, comes to the heart of the second chapter. There's a few principles that need to be discussed. Firstly, yes, it is your duty in a sense, but I would also say it's your duty when we try to translate karma kanda duties to this modern world. But actually, in one sense, our duties, it's actually almost impossible for us to execute our duties just because we're not in a varnashram community, if you get what I mean. So on the one hand, we should always keep that in mind, that we try to apply these principles in order to realize it, but ultimately it's almost impossible to practice karma yoga outside of a varnashram community, right? Because the prescribed duties aren't able to be practiced, right? But we can also, yes, we are in Shudra life, but I think even our society is sometimes struggling to come to the platform of Shudra life, right? So it's one of those things where, yeah, but even ignoring that, right? And I do think, not ignoring that, but I do think we can set that aside in order to come to the central point. Yes, when we're practicing Nishkama Karma Yoga, that's the whole point, right? Because this will sound maybe somewhat unrealistic or something, but actually, how much do we need to gain more and more, right? When we have that desire to move ahead and progress forth in the career, His Holiness Bhakti Vikash Maharaj, he says, like, when you count up your expenses, food, water, electricity, and that's all you need to survive, right? And you don't need to competitively move through a work ladder in order to achieve that, right? But that's not even the answer that I'm giving. That's if we were discussing Nishkama Karma Yoga, right? And still, naturally, you would progress. If let's say theoretically, right, it's somebody's job to be in the corporate ladder, right? By doing a good job, you move up the ladder, right? Without really caring. Ideally, right? They want the best workers to move up, right? Irregardless of the fruit, right? So it's not saying that climbing up is bad, but hankering for extra results and all, yeah, something that one should be renounced from. Now, how to do that? Because that is very, very difficult. And that, again, I guess, is the whole central thrust of that final thing we discussed in the second chapter, right? How can we do that? It's very hard when we're just trying to remove ourselves from it, to remove ourselves from the desire for fruits. How do we do it? We do it by engaging ourselves in Krishna's service. in two ways. One, because what money we have, we use it in the service of Krishna, right? And in that sense, there could theoretically be someone, I don't think it's a particularly effective thing, but somebody could say, oh, well, I want to make a bit more so I can donate more. But I personally would think that that sort of mindset is a dangerous one, right? You're flirting a bit too much with falling into the, you know what I mean, the traps, wanting the fruits. But when one is engaged in Krishna service, then all of the reasons, all of the fruits that one wants are ultimately for one's enjoyment, right? We want more money so we can live comfortably, so that we can do this, so that we can do that. But once we're absorbed in Krishna, then param drishtva nivartate, right? Then what else do I want, right? What else do I need? Like just the bare necessities to keep on going, and what I need then in service to Krishna, right? So I guess if one is aspiring to make more in order to provide basic sustenance, that's not hankering for fruits, right? Because you're doing it for basic sustenance, which is a devotional quality, right? Because you need to be alive in order to perform Krishna consciousness, right? But then hankering for more, we can ask ourselves, well, why then do I want more, right? And then when that question is truly answered, then we can see, right? Is this being utilized in Krishna service or not? And I honestly feel like in most cases it's not, right? That time better is spent directly, right, in book distribution or in preaching or in chanting or in studying Prabhupada's books. So it's not that I'm saying working competitively is bad, but I'm just saying there's a yoga ladder, and when we're at that, and we can cut through the whole ladder by practicing Krishna consciousness, right? The large reservoir of water, which fulfills the purpose of all other methods. I've sort of said a lot of things, and did they address it, or do you want to push back a bit, which I'm totally happy to do if I maybe focused on secondary issues?
No, Prabhu, I don't want to push it back. It's just that in my mind, there's always a constant struggle that, you know, how do you overcome this thing? But I guess my takeaway from what you said is like the hankering. Do we want more? And then the question, why do we need more? So it's a matter of choice, I guess, then. And that's, I feel in my mind, that choice will define how well we are progressing towards realization of and towards bhakti, I guess.
I would say it's not even a choice necessarily. I would say it's how much have we encountered the beauty of Krishna. The more we encounter the beauty for Krishna, the less appealing everything else becomes.
Absolutely.
Right? So
yes,
I think in that sense, the question is how deeply are we relating to the holy name when we chant? How much are we beginning to see Krishna spring forth from the pages of the Bhagavatam? How much do we reciprocate when we have darshan of Radha Gopinath or whoever the deities are that we are serving under, right? That is the question. And the deeper and deeper we go in appreciation of that beauty of Krishna, which will be the beginning point of next week, that beauty of Krishna, then everything else loses its appeal. Again, it's that, there's a reason I focused on it so much. It's the heart of our spiritual life. Param drishtva nivartate, going deeper and deeper and deeper into how much do we experience that higher taste of all the beauty and sweetness that is Krishna. And I guess in terms of actually addressing the struggle, I think the answer is chant and be happy, right? The answer really is Krishna is the all attractive. And the more and more we can truly relish him as the all attractive, we'll realize how unattractive everything else actually really is.
Yes, Prabhu. Thank you so much. I think you just nailed it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure if I missed it, but I think I did miss in the first half, but I think that was the concern. Thank you for the great question. Very nice question, because it really comes to all of the questions the second chapter builds up. Now, if you're all confused about the second chapter in the Yoga Ladder, good, because Arjuna is as well, and that's what the remainder of our study will be. Any other questions? Okay, homework, what did I say? I said first 9 texts of chapter 3, right? Good. Then I reckon read from, I'm going to give small chunks from here on in, because I want you all to do the thinking about the assignment now, right? So 10 to 16 then. Read chapter 3, texts 10 to 16, and please work on writing out your answers. You definitely can answer the first question, and you should be leaning towards having a decent idea for the second one. But you'll have a much better idea when we finish chapter 3. But it shouldn't be so scary for you, the question anymore, at least, right? Okay, so please do that. I'll see you all next week. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindubhyaeva patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Thank you so much.
Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.